Ladies and gentlemen, how you doing? My name is Bob Krishna. I am a student at Pikes Community College, and tonight I'm going to tell you a tale that I wrote myself. It's a combination of stories from my youth that I've entitled The Serpent's Lesson. It was hot the day that I caught my first snake. It was the South Georgia kind of a heat that even the trees seemed to wilt. And it was the perfect heat to turn that red clay ground into a sandy soil that snakes would warm themselves on in preparation for the evening hunt. And that's exactly what my snake was doing that day as I pedaled my bike past it that Saturday afternoon. He was lying there in the sand on the dry creek bed by the side of the road, and I didn't really know if I'd seen a snake or not, so I slammed back my pedals like kids do, causing that bike to spin around, and I'm looking back through a cloud of dust at what I think is a snake. And it turns out that it is. It's a long snake, 3.5, 4 feet long. It's got a thick black body that's glistening in the sun, and it's just laying there, staring back at me, kind of oblivious to my presence. And I thought, why should it care what a 13-year-old boy's doing on a Saturday afternoon? It doesn't need to worry about me. It's got everything it needs to survive right there with it and has for its entire life. It paid me no mind whatsoever. Unfortunately for him, and if he had known this, I was not a typical 13-year-old boy that Saturday, and if he had known it, he would have fled as fast as he could go, because over the next hour, we were going to become figuratively and literally intertwined. For me, it was going to be an hour filled with lessons. There was going to be a lesson in mastering fear. There was going to be a lesson on the limitations of love. And there was going to be a lesson on my father and fatherhood that started this day, but I wouldn't realize for years in the future how important that lesson was going to be. For the snake, who only understood survival, I suspect the next hour was going to be filled with nothing but terror. Now, the reason I was not typical that Saturday afternoon was just the night prior I had watched a new kind of animal show. It was supposed to be like Marlin Perkins, but better. And it was so much better. There was this young guy. He was trekking through the forests of South America, and he was catching everything he could catch, but mostly snakes. And what he had taught me was that if you come across a snake and you don't have the proper equipment, you can still catch it. You just need to get yourself a forked stick. So obviously, I laid my bike in the dust and took off into the woods looking for that perfect stick. And it was an agonizing search because every second I could hear my prize slithering away, laughing in that staccato way that snakes laugh. And but I wanted to catch the snake, so I kept the search going, and finally I found it, the perfect stick. It was about 2 feet long, had that Y at the end, each point about 2 inches long, inch thick, very solid, almost by design. And it was such a perfect stick that I didn't want the snake to see it. So I stayed in the woods as I worked my way back to where the snake had been resting in the sun. And when I came out of the woods, I was exactly where I needed to be, about 3 feet behind it. Now, I do remember wondering why it hadn't moved in all this time. And I do remember wondering what I was going to do with it when I caught it. But I didn't wonder either of those things for very long. And as if I had prepared for this moment for my entire life, I lunged forward with that stick and managed to pin him right there on the ground. Then he was aware of my presence, and then he sprang to life with all the ferocity that he could muster. The stick had gone down right behind his neck, just like it was supposed to have, and his body rippled back and forth at this unexpected trap, trying to get away. For myself, my plan was working so much better than my brain that I just immediately reached down and grabbed him up, just like I had been taught. Putting a little bit of pressure behind his head and wrapping my hand around his body, I pulled the stick out of the ground, hoisted my prize into the air, and realized how much trouble I was in almost immediately. That snake coiled itself from my wrist to my elbow and began to squeeze my arm with a strength that was shocking in its power. I could feel his tension in his head trying to pull against my thumb as he was fighting for his very survival, and I imagined that my fingers were already going numb from his coils. And as I turned to look at my prey with a newfound respect, I found myself mesmerized. I was caught staring, and I don't know what caught me. I don't know if it was that black tongue slashing back and forth. I don't know if it were the fangs that had suddenly shown up in its mouth, dripping that little yellow. I'm not even certain if it was just the brilliant white of his mouth that is known throughout the world to hiss death with a southern accent. But I was stuck, and I was staring, and that snake had me in its eye. Merely seconds, I'm sure, but it felt like forever. And what the snake was telling me was that from this moment forward, if I made just one mistake, that I very well may die. And that harsh reality pinned me to the ground. And as I sat there and thought of one reason to feel better, I couldn't. And I began to cry there in the Georgia sun on the side of the road. And I sniffled and cried and realized that the only person that was going to be able to help me was me. And I was going to have to master my fear and my terror of this moment and figure out something to do. Now I had two choices of a place to go. I could go to the 7-Eleven from which I just came, or I could go home. Well, scared little boys only have so much logic in them, and that logic goes as far as their mothers. So I picked home. And having the destination made it easier. I don't know how I did it, but I did. I moved to my bike, which caused the snake to keep, every time I took a step, the snake would move, and I would stop. And I would shuffle and stop and shuffle and stop, and I finally got to my bike, and with that one hand, I managed to mount it, point it in the direction of home, and began pedaling myself back to my mom. I didn't look at the snake on my arm. I knew it was there. I knew it hated me. But I also knew that I only had to hold on to that fear for just a few more minutes because I was going home. I was going home to my mommy, and she was going to fix it. Now, my mommy, and most of you seem to know what's coming, she hated two things in life. She hated being interrupted in the bathroom by any one of her 3 children, and she hated snakes. Other than that, she was a fairy tale mother. She was quick with kisses for owies, hugs for boo-boos, and she protected her children with a fierce passion that she still protects us with today. So you can imagine my surprise that after I pounded on the door loudly enough to be heard over the shower, and urgently enough to get more than an angry go away, when that door opened just a crack and I tearfully pled for help with my snake-clad arm, my mother slammed that door right back shut. Well, at the time, I was broken. In hindsight, what more could I have expected? But as a 13-year-old, that afternoon, I was done, and I almost let go and gave up right there. But then I realized, for reasons known only to my mother, that she had a phone in the bathroom with her, which in this day means you had to carry the phone into the bathroom with you. And she was screaming into the phone to my father that he had to come home right now because his son had a snake on his arm, and she didn't care what was going on. He needed to get here now. And then the bathroom door opened again, a much smaller crack than before. And I was told very sternly to go wait in the front yard for my father, and he would be the one that would come home and fix it. And the door slammed shut again, and my second lesson of the hour was over before I even knew it had started. And that lesson was that sometimes love falls to fear. And when that happens, it's terrible for both people that are involved. But as I made my way to my front yard thinking the immature, childish versions of those thoughts, the snake and I came to a bit of an understanding. I wouldn't squeeze him too hard, and he wouldn't squeeze me too hard either. And as we settled into this wary truce on my front porch, waiting for my dad to come home, we were both tired, we were both exhausted, and neither one of us knew what the day was going to bring us. Now, my dad worked on base there in Fort Stewart, Georgia, and it usually took about 20 to 30 minutes to get back home. Well, this Saturday afternoon, the traffic must have been light, because he came around the corner about 10 minutes later. And as he pulled into the driveway, I can only imagine what he was thinking as he came across his only son and oldest child standing in the yard, tensely tall, with his arm thrust out to his side. It was an arm that was much thicker than normal and moved on occasion. And so as he settled into the car and started to come out to the yard and approach his tear-faced son, he said in the calmest and most soothing of voices, "What have you got there, Bobby?" "A snake." And that was my answer. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I knew suddenly it was going to be okay. I just knew it was going to be okay. I didn't know how. I didn't know what we were going to do. I just knew it was going to be okay. He didn't say anything else for a few minutes. He just walked around me in a bit of a circle, kind of assessing the situation to see what we were going to do. And then, in that same tone, he said, "Let's go ahead and get this thing off your arm, son, but don't let go of it just yet." And he reached out and he grabbed hold of the tail of the snake, which of course started it going again. But by this point, we were just terribly tired. And it wasn't long until my dad had the upper hand. And as he got the snake off my arm, he grabbed hold of the head himself, and I was free. And I almost bolted for the house, but I didn't want to leave my dad there with the snake by himself, so I didn't run. And he looked over at me and gave me a wink and asked me if the dogs had ever seen a snake. Well, we didn't know. So we let the snake loose, and we let the dogs loose, and it turned out that they had not seen a snake, and nor had they ever really wanted to. And as we laughed at the dogs, I realized that this last lesson, this lesson of my father, was the most important lesson, but I didn't understand that it wasn't finished that day. As I fell asleep that night thinking about my day, and I thought about it for many nights thereafter, I came to this conclusion. I should never have picked up the snake in the first place. But having picked up the snake, I had been given a valuable lesson in how fear works. I had to master my own fear just to start this thing going. And that's a lesson I carried with me all of my life. And I had to realize that sometimes fear will overwhelm love, and that's nobody's fault. And that was a difficult one to deal with, but it was there and it was done. But the last lesson, I didn't finish realizing that lesson until I'd become a father in my own right, and it was many years later. My 1-year-old had just managed to throw herself out of a window that opened over a concrete porch. She'd fallen several feet. And as I rushed outside to assess the damage, all the fears of life running through my head, I had a vivid memory of my father and a tear-faced boy and an angry snake. And I realized that the lesson of that day was not mastering my fear. It was how you master the fear of a child. And so as I came around the corner to see my daughter crouched on the front porch in a pile of broken glass, obviously unharmed, but very, very afraid, I reached out to her, and in that soothing tone of memory, I told her it was going to be okay. And she believed me. Thank you very much.